This morning, we are going to be watching a video. It's 30 minutes by Professor Amy Jill Levine, who is at Vanderbilt University, where she teaches actually the New Testament. But she's, as you will find out, she's pretty good when it comes to talking about the Old Testament as well. We're going to focus this week on Samuel, the prophet Samuel, and Saul. And then next week we're going to look at King David. So that's the focus of the two classes. The beginning of kingship in ancient Israel, starting with Saul and then King David. And she's going to be giving both lectures. So we'll start with her. Hopefully, as you will see, she's giving such a broad overview. What I would like to do after she finishes is go back and delve into a couple of the passages that she actually talks about to get a little bit better feeling of the nuances that she's just not quite able to get across because she has to cover so much. So keep your fingers crossed, and if everything goes well, then we can start with this video here. Okay, let me open here. Okay, hit play. Let me move this back just a little bit. Please don't start all over. There we go.
From the stories of Othniel and Ehud and Deborah and Gideon, we can see that a judge is not simply someone who would sit in a courtroom and engage in decision-making over land disputations or over whose ox gored whose. To the contrary, judges are charismatic leaders imbued by the Spirit of God. The Spirit actually enters into them. And then they function primarily as military leaders, but also as public figures who can lead the land both into safety and then into peace. The problem is, in the second part of the book of Judges, that the entire institution begins to break down as the judges don't immediately receive the Spirit or don't receive it at all, as they make rash vows, and by the time we get up to Samson, as they're not even aware of what their divine commission is. So in the second part of discussion on the book of Judges, we'll see how the community descends into chaos as the office of judge itself falls apart. We'll first meet Abimelech, whom we've already encountered in the last lecture, the false judge. We will move on to Jephthah, the tragic judge. Then we'll see Samson, judge as farce. And finally, the end of the book where there are no judges, the apostasy of the tribe of Dan, and then finally, the rape of the Levites' concubine, a rape that signals finally the complete and total chaos into which the covenant community had.
This appears to be the wrong lecture here. I'm sorry. I thought I had the right one loaded in there. Bear with me for a second here. Let me see.
We begin here with Abimelech. Abimelech, whose father is Gideon, and Abimelech, whose name is...
I thought I had that all. Oh, you got it. All right, but apparently I didn't. My apologies.
Name is my father is king. That's what the Hebrew means. But he is, however, a false judge, and we know he set up.
Is this what you want?
Okay, here we go. If you want to all come in, I'll pause it till you all come in. Take a seat.
Watch out for the cord.
Yeah, watch that cord. Already tripped me up once.
Want to give us a little intro?
Yeah, I will. What we're going to watch is, this is the first of two lectures that Professor Levine is going to give on the transition between the period of the judges in the ancient, among the ancient Israelites to getting their first king. And we're going to see it's Samuel, so Prophet Samuel, who anoints Saul as king. And this lecture deals specifically with Samuel, the interaction between Samuel and Saul. And then the lecture next week is going to deal with King David. So we're going to focus upon the two early kings of ancient Israel. Okay. All right. So we'll try this one more time.
The very loosely knit tribal confederacy under the charismatic leaders called judges has now completely disintegrated. But some need for a government still remains because the Philistine threat is still there. Consequently, when we move into 1 Samuel, we will find the need for the monarchy recited over and over again. But 1 Samuel does not begin with a monarchy. To the contrary, it begins with the birth of Samuel in what looks like a very calm and pleasant society, as if somehow we're back to the good old days when people were not being raped or chopped into bits. The beginning of the story of Samuel portends good things for Israel. We have an account of a married couple, and we haven't seen them in a while. But here, a married couple who actually seem to love each other. Hannah, a woman, and her husband Elkanah, and every year they go up to the local shrine at Shiloh to offer sacrifices. Nobody attacks them on the way. It looks quite good. But it turns out that Hannah is distressed because Hannah has no children. We've seen this before. And not only does Hannah replay the literary convention, the type scene of a barren woman to whom an annunciation will be given, but it may well be that Hannah, in her loneliness, in her barrenness, represents the loss that the community still feels, that somehow she embodies a sense of hope, a sense of needing to be fulfilled. She represents the community here on a very positive level. She also resembles all those infertile women from Genesis. Like Sarah and like Rachel, there is a fertile co-wife there. Her name is Peninnah. And Hannah simply cannot bear the fact that her husband has children with the co-wife. So every year when they go up to the shrine at Shiloh, Hannah prays for a child. And her husband simply can't understand why Hannah is so desperate. And he says to her at one point, "Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" And she answers not. Because for a woman who can't have a child in Hannah's case, the answer is no, you're not. Hannah goes up to the shrine and prays passionately for a child. And she actually offers a vow, but here a positive one, unlike Jephthah's. She prays, "Lord of hosts, if you will only take notice of my trouble, and you will remember me, if you will not forget me, but grant me offspring, then I shall give the child to the Lord for the whole of his life, and no razor shall ever touch his head. He, like Samson, will be a Nazirite." Samson the Nazirite is a fool. Samuel the Nazirite is a genius. She prays her prayer, and Eli the priest at Shiloh looks at her and notices that her lips are moving and her eyes are closed and she's fervently praying. And he thinks she's drunk. And he says to her, "Put away your wine, woman. This is not the way you should behave at the house of God." And she explains to him, "No, I've been praying for a child." And Eli recognizes the depth and concern that she shows. And here, another annunciation. He tells her, "Yes, you will have a child." Eli is ready to recognize true piety. The lives of Eli and Hannah's child Samuel will be intertwined. Because just as Eli originally is unable to realize the depth of Hannah's prayer, so too there are gaps in his own life. It turns out he has 2 sons who are also priests, but he simply cannot control them. And we learn as early as chapter 2 that his sons are serving at the sacrifices, and they're taking the best cuts of meat for themselves, and worse, they're actually having sex with some of the women who are coming up to the shrine. This simply cannot stay. And we learned that although God had promised Eli that his children would always, the expression goes, go in and out before me forever, always serve as priests at Yahweh's altar, God simply cannot stand this apostasy in which the priests are engaged. And he says that promise is now revoked. So God's loyalties will shift to Samuel. In celebration of her motherhood, because Hannah does in fact become pregnant and does in fact have a child, she sings a magnificent hymn called the Song of Hannah. This is a staple, the woman making celebration not only over victory but also over pregnancy. We've seen women's victory songs with Deborah. We've seen a short victory song with Miriam at the Song of the Sea. And for those within the Christian tradition, Hannah's song becomes the model for Mary's Magnificat at the beginning of Luke, when Mary celebrates the birth of Jesus. This song is, however, less a paean to childbirth. It's less thanking God for the fact that Hannah herself has had a child than it is, well, a political manifesto. Hannah is expressing national yearnings. She predicts in her song social upheaval where the mighty are brought down and the weak are raised up. And she also speaks about her own changing circumstances, but in broader terms, the barren are made fertile. And that will finally be what will happen to the kingdom of Israel. Hannah bears her son Samuel. She nurses him, and when she weans him, she makes good on her vow. And she takes him up to the shrine at Shiloh and puts him in trust to Eli the priest. And Samuel begins to serve at God's altar. And that's where his call comes from, as he's there serving for God. And by the way, his mother never actually leaves him. We're told in this very, very delicate note that every year Hannah would come up to the shrine at Shiloh with a little coat, a little cloak that she had made for him. The mother's love continues. Hannah has not forgotten Samuel, and nor has God. And finally, the word of the Lord, we're told, was rare in those days, but it comes to Samuel when he is lying down in the temple where the ark of God was. We're now in 1 Samuel chapter 3. Samuel hears a voice. He thinks it's Eli the priest calling, so he runs into Eli's room and says, "What can I do for you?" And Eli says, "Go back to sleep. I didn't call." By the third time, Eli realizes, it's God calling. And he tells Samuel to be prepared and to tell God that he, Samuel, is ready. God commissions Samuel to be his messenger, and by the end of chapter 3, we're told Samuel grew and the Lord was with him. And as the expression goes, let none of his words fall to the ground. In other words, everything that Samuel said was heeded by the people, and everything that Samuel said was given to him by God. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, from top to bottom, north to south, knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord, as the text continues. For the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh. And this portends great things for Israel. It looks really good. Samuel combines the strength of Israel's earlier leaders, like Moses. God speaks to him and the people listen. Like Aaron, he's got priestly duties because he's serving at the shrine. Like Joshua, he's able to unite the people from Dan to Beersheba, and they listen to him. And Samuel indeed sets up a witness stone in testimony to his truth, just like Joshua did at the covenant ceremony at Shechem. And like Deborah, we're told about Samuel chapter 7, he judged Israel all the days of his life. He looks like the perfect leader. He's got the ear of the people, and God loves him. But there's still no centralized government, and the Philistines are still out there. And somebody's got to help out. And we actually find out that a need for a centralized government and a standing military is not only just a need, but it's essential. The story of Samuel, his birth and then his death notice, provides the frame for what's called the ark narrative. Samuel, as we know, had been at the shrine of Shiloh with the ark, but when the Israelites go into battle, the ark goes with them. And what happens in chapter 4 is that the ark is captured by the Philistines, and during that capture, the two sons of Eli, those wicked apostatizing priests, are slain. When the ark is captured, a Benjamite who happened to be fighting on Israel's side comes to Eli, who was 98 years old at the time and blind. And he tells Eli, the ark of the Lord has been captured, your sons are slain. And Eli, who's sitting on a stool, and we're told he's very heavy, falls over and he dies. And the news also comes to his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, one of his children. She's pregnant and she gives birth prematurely. And in her last moment, she names her child. She calls him Ichabod, which means the glory has departed from Israel. So here again, a child represents the community's fate. And at this point, the Deuteronomic historian, whom, as we've already seen in the book of Judges, can move from farce to pathos and farce very quickly, actually moves from this highly emotional scene of a dead priest and a dead daughter-in-law and a premature baby to a farce. And we have the ark narrative, the story of the peripatetic ark being dragged from Philistine city to Philistine city. In fact, some biblical scholars have suggested this too is a literary convention. We have from the ancient Near East stories of gods represented by their statues being moved from town to town to town, either being in exile because of war or deserting their people because they don't like the way their people are behaving. Here's the ark representing God. The Philistines bring the ark to the Philistine temple at Ashdod, and there's an idol there called Dagon. And unfortunately, Dagon the idol keeps bowing down to the ark, so the Philistines have to upright Dagon again, and then Dagon bows down again and falls to pieces. The citizens of Ashdod say, we better get rid of this ark. So they ship the ark off to Gath, which is where Goliath is from. And we'll meet Goliath when we finally meet King David. What exactly happens to the people in Gath is not quite clear. It depends upon how you want to translate the Hebrew. They either broke out into tumors or they broke out into hemorrhoids. Either way, it's not a good scene. So the Gathites ship the ark to Ekron. The people in Ekron cry out, quote, they have brought around to us the ark of the God of Israel to slay us and our people. So the people of Ekron don't want it either. And they finally, after consulting with their own priests, come to the conclusion that they will leave it up to some god, either theirs or the one of Israel, to determine what to do with the ark. They tie the ark to two cows that have just calved, 2 milk cows. The idea is, if you are a cow, unlikely to happen, and you have just had a calf, you need that calf to nurse, because otherwise you, the cow, will simply explode in built up milk. The idea is the cows would probably stay in Philistine territory to be near their calves. But what we're told is the two cows, looking neither left nor right, mooing as they go, head back toward Israelite territory and bring the ark back home. They head to Beth Shemesh, where the Levites pick up the ark, dispatch the cows as a sacrifice to God, and the ark remains in Israelite territory for 20 years until David establishes his capital in Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 6 and brings the ark up there. But God will not always rescue the people quite as easily with tumors and falling down idols. We need a king to help out, and that's what we get next. When Samuel became old, we're told, at the end of the ark narrative, he made his sons judges over Israel. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after gain, they took bribes, and they perverted justice. Well, the story of Samuel is not done. He will continue up through the rest of this book. But we're already told early on that Samuel cannot establish his dynasty. Some other sort of ruler is needed. The judge isn't going to work. We've seen that from the book of Judges. Charismatic leaders cannot hold. Samuel the prophet and priest cannot hold. A new type of leadership is needed. In 1 Samuel chapters 8 through 11, we have a compromised view of the monarchy. The upshot is kingship is to be granted to these people, but the king must be subservient to God. God will still be the people's ruler. It will be God who chooses the king. It used to be thought that these particular chapters were the combination of 2 different sources, one a pro-monarchical source and one an anti-monarchical source. That may be the case, but these days biblical scholars think that in fact both views are written by the same Deuteronomic historian, expressing the historian's own ambivalence about the kingship. It's necessary, but it's not quite what Israel was founded to be. And we can see that ambivalence even in Samuel's own discussion with the people. The people come up to Samuel and they say, give us a king to govern us like all the nations. And Samuel responds, look, God is your king. If you take a king like all the other nations, you'll be undermining Yahweh's rule. Moreover, what happened to the egalitarian impulse of Yahwism that we saw underneath the covenant where everybody is equal? A king establishes class distinctions. And a monarchy thereby entails Israel's loss of unique status. Under Yahweh, they are not like all the other nations. They are a nation wholly and distinct apart. And if the theological explanations were not sufficient, Samuel gives the people practical explanations for why they shouldn't want a king. Kings will take your sons, he says, to populate their armies, and they'll take your daughters for the palace staff. They'll take 1/10 of your flock, they'll take the best of your cattle, they'll take your donkeys, and you shall be, Samuel says, the king's slaves. The conclusion at this point is kingship is not good for the people and it's an offense to God, but despite what Samuel says, the people are resolved. The irony is, by the way, that everything Samuel said actually came true. By the time we get up to King Saul, we find all of these predictions. By the time we get up to King Solomon. So that King Solomon has a corvée, forced labor. We already saw that with slavery in Egypt. He has a major capital center with a temple, with a palace, with the entire infrastructure that a capital center requires, both to work for the monarchy and to work for the centralized cult. He's got a royal priesthood, he's got a royal harem with international gods, he's got an overextended economy, too much importing, too little exporting, he's got a heavily taxed and increasingly frustrated peasant class, and there will be a revolt after he dies. In the Bible, like everything else, be careful what you ask for, right? Nevertheless, although tepid, the Bible also offers a somewhat pro-monarchical condition. This is 1 Samuel 9. We see already the change in the perspective and the change in the description of Samuel. Here he's no longer the one who has the ear of the people from north to south. He's simply a country seer. He's a local fortune teller, a finder of lost objects. And here the deity actually seems to favor some sort of monarchical rule. But God doesn't quite ask for a king yet. God says, it's okay if you have a prince. And this brings us to the story of the prince who becomes king, Saul. Here's the description. I will send you a man from Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel. He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have seen the affliction of my people because their cry has come out to me. We've seen this before. A new leader will be raised up, but a different type of leader. Saul's introduction is a tad on the problematic side. I get the feeling when looking at it that his primary job qualifications are good looks and wealth. Here's how we meet Saul. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, a man of wealth. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. He's rich and he's drop dead gorgeous. Other than that, it's not clear what his qualifications are to lead the people. Nor are we sure he will make a good leader when we finally see him in action, and indeed we already have. Think back to the tight scene of men who meet women at wells. This is where we first see King Saul. He meets some young women coming up to draw water in chapter 9, verse 11, but he's not looking for a bride. He is, as you will recall, looking for his father's lost donkeys. And the women sent him on his way. Go to the local seer. And that turns out to be the prophet Samuel. Perhaps he will help you. The type scene, as you know, was aborted. Saul will not marry these women in the same way that he will not complete his kingship. And he goes to Samuel, and Samuel says to him, you're going to be king. And Saul, in typical fashion, you might think of Gideon or Moses in the background, and he's reluctant. He says, I'm a Benjaminite, it's the least of the tribes of Israel. And he goes on, is not my family the humblest of all the families of the tribes of Benjamin? Fat chance. We already know that his father's wealthy. Perhaps given both Saul's own doubts and Samuel's as well, Samuel anoints Saul in secret. It's not time for the public inauguration yet. And when Samuel finally does make a public announcement regarding Saul's anointing, the events are not really auspicious. The tribes are collected, and lots are cast to determine whom God will choose to be king. And the lots fall upon the tribe of Benjamin, and then to a particular clan, and then to Saul's household, and finally the lots fall upon Saul. And the people look for Saul, but when they saw him, he could not be found, so they inquired of the Lord. I'm citing chapter 10 here. And the Lord said, behold, he has hidden himself among the baggage. And when Samuel then asserts, do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? There is none like him among all the people. I wonder about the tone that he would have used, because kings do not usually hang out among the baggage. Some of the assembled crowd immediately shout out, long live the king. It's in the Bible. We didn't invent it from the British monarchy. But some fellows, called worthless by the narrator, ask, quote, how can this man save us? And it seems to me that the question is in fact not without merit. So as Israel struggles to harmonize its original egalitarian tradition underneath the covenant with this centralized monarchy, we also find Saul trying to deal with this new change not only in Israel's status, but within his own. And Saul's in a very difficult spot because Samuel himself is quite ambivalent about this kingship idea. And it seems almost as if Samuel is setting Saul up for failure. Saul does go to war against the Philistines, and for the most part he is winning. But at one point in the midst of a military campaign, he and Samuel had agreed to meet for Samuel to offer sacrifice. And Saul waits, and he waits, and he waits, and the people are beginning to leave, and he needs them to be gathered together. But Samuel has not shown up. And we're told Saul waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, which is where they were, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul finally said, "Bring the burnt offerings here to me and the peace offerings," 1 Samuel 13. And thereby, the king usurps Samuel's role. The king is not supposed to be the one to offer sacrifice. That's the job of the priest. And as Saul completes his sacrifice, Samuel arrives, but only to pronounce condemnation. And he says to Saul, "Your kingdom will not continue," which is not what you need to hear when you're a military leader, right? The account of Saul's transgression is in fact given a different spin in chapter 15, where his culpability, his guilt, and the situation of his rejection are even worse. There's a raid against the Amalekites, but this is holy war, and within holy war, one is supposed to take every bit of that booty and dedicate it to God, and the men who are captured are supposed to be killed. We've seen this already. But Saul preserves some of the booty, and Saul and the people spared the king of the Amalekites, his name is Agag, as well as the best of the sheep and the oxen and the fatlings and the lambs and all that was good, and refused utterly to destroy them. This is totally against the rules of holy war. Saul is here in violation of divine commands, and we're told at this point God repents of making Saul king. Samuel arrives and accuses Saul of transgressing the dictates of holy war and of failing to honor God. And Saul repents, but it's too late. And we're told, quote, "Samuel hewed Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal." Samuel's sacrifice to God. And we're also told at that point that Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. And Saul's untenable position culminates in his final tragedy. God causes an evil spirit to come upon Saul. He can't get rest. He has no peace. We'll see in the next lecture that it's only through David's playing his harp that Saul gains any sense of serenity. His torment is divinely caused. His people are not entirely loyal. We discover that his harp player, the young David, will usurp his popularity and then usurp his throne. His daughter Michal, who's in love with David, will betray him. His son Jonathan will also betray him because Jonathan's loyalty is to David. His remaining children and grandchildren will either be killed or stripped of their power, and Saul will be left a solitary, tragic figure, and his death confirms the tragedy as well as the fragility of his role. Again, facing Philistine onslaught, Saul realizes he needs Samuel's support, Samuel's help. But not only has Samuel not spoken with him since the incident at Gilgal, Samuel is dead. Saul's stuck. He needs to speak to Samuel. What's he gonna do? Worse, the one way you can speak to somebody who's dead is you get a medium to cause the ghosts to come out of the ground. But we're also told that Saul, in one of his executive orders, had put all the mediums and wizards out of the land. So Saul, contravening his own law, seeks a medium. He goes to his servants and he says, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her." And attesting to the total inability of Saul to rule and the inefficacy of his laws, the servants find a medium, right? Nobody was paying much attention to what Saul says. They go to the land of Endor. And for those of you who know that old TV show Bewitched, Endora, that's where the name comes from. And the witch there, the medium of Endor, conjures up the spirit of Samuel. And the medium tells Saul, "I see a God coming up out of the earth." And when Saul inquires, "What is his appearance?" she responds, "He is an old man coming up, and he is wrapped in a cloak, And it's the same word used for the cloak that Samuel's mother, Hannah, used to bring to him when he was at the temple in Shiloh. And it's an odd word, so in fact we know this is Samuel. And Saul knew it was Samuel, and Samuel says to Saul, "You will lose the battle." Saul then refuses to eat, and ironically and graciously, the medium, whose life had been put in danger by Saul's executive order, kills a fatted calf and gives him dinner, and says basically, "You need your strength because you've got a battle on the morrow." And the next morning, Saul and his son Jonathan die in battle. Here's the tragedy. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they would take armor and jewelry. They found Saul and his 3 sons lying dead on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head, they stripped him of his armor, and they sent messengers through the length and breadth of their land to carry the good news to idols, to their gods, and to the people alike. Because here they have prevailed over Israel. They have killed Israel's king. They deposit his armor in the temple of Ashtoreth as a sign that they have won, and they nail his body on the wall of Bethshan. So even in death, Saul is humiliated. But when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead, a town Saul had protected, heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all of the warriors among them set out, and they journeyed to recover the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan. They brought him back to Jabesh. They burn the bodies, and they take the bones, and they bury them underneath a tamarisk tree in Jabesh Gilead. And for 7 days they fast. And that's the end of the story of King Saul. But it's not the end of the story of the monarchy. The pro-monarchical forces, the pro-monarchical voice is actually right. The Philistines are on the horizon. Somebody needs to help out. Somebody needs to redeem the kingship. And thereby we come to King David. But as we'll see, King David will replace some of these same conventions that we saw back with the judges and back even with Saul. An inauspicious beginning, association with worthless and reckless fellows. King David will even make an alliance with the Philistines. In the same way that the Israelites had to fight their way into Canaan, David is going to have to fight his way into the kingship. And will he succeed? Yes. And why? Because finally, for one more time, God has changed his mind and he will establish his kingdom. And the final scene that we'll see that guarantees this kingdom is that royal grant covenant that we already know God will give. So David gets what Saul never had, the covenant with God, the royal grant like Noah had and like Abraham had, the promise of eternal kingship. So in the next lecture, we will meet King David, hanging about with worthless fellows, beloved of God, a player of the harp, a slayer of Goliath, and a man who finally loses his role again by committing adultery, by having his sons go to war against him, and finally by dying a lonely, cold old man alone in his bed.
Wow. No idea. What a story.
Go back and the rest of it I remember, but I didn't know David died alone in his bed. We all do die alone in our bed.
So, what sorts of questions do you have about that? Anything that she talked about that you want to? She really did what?
She's been on PBS.
Oh, she said she did a good job of telling it all, and I said, yeah,
she
she did.
really
Yeah,
covered
she-
a lot of ground. I forget her name. She's been on PBS.
Levine is her name. She's at Vanderbilt University. She teaches
she's
New
been on
Testament
NPR quite a
theology.
bit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm a fan of stories, fairy tales, and just stories, and what do they mean to a person now?
Mhm.
So I would like you to address that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. In order to make sense out of what's happening right here, you have to understand that the Israelites had moved into Canaan, into the land of Canaan. But the problem is that the land of Canaan was already populated, and there were a number of tribes already living there. It was a tribal society, and she picked up on this really well, and that is that there was a rough egalitarianism among all of the tribes' peoples, right? There are 12 different tribes, and among each tribe there, I mean, you know, some people are wealthier than others, but theoretically at least, there's an egalitarianism among all of these people, and they have no such thing as a king. They don't have a king. What they do have, in order to give them some semblance of cohesion and unity, is they are ruled over by a series of judges, right? A series of judges. And the judges do a fairly good job of, you know, if there was some sort of a crime or a trespass or something like this, then you would take your case to the judge, and there were many of these within each tribe, and you would seek justice this way, and it worked really well for keeping peace among the tribespeople. The problem is these judges are not warriors, right? These judges are not warriors. They're sort of sacred figures. And what this means is that the Israelites are just being hammered by the surrounding tribes, right? And part of the problem is that they have no major leader in war. They are sort of fighting, you know, these 12 independent tribes are fighting on their own. And if you begin to read Samuel, the Israelites understand what's wrong. They say, we need someone to lead us into war. In other words, give us a king, give us a warlord that we can follow into war, and it's going to unify all of us, because if we're unified, we can probably stand up to these people. But the problem is that there's nothing in the history of the Israelites to either predict this or to accommodate this, because they haven't had a king up to this point, right? They've had a number of prophets, and they've had a number of priests, and the closest that they've come to probably would be Moses, who is sort of a priest, prophet figure who leads them, but as far as having a king or a warlord, they just haven't had that, and that's what they're asking for. So this is the issue, okay? But in order to make sense out of why this doesn't work out, because in the end, Saul, he's defeated, right? He's defeated by the Philistines, and so, you know, the Hebrews are around there, the Israelites are around scratching their heads saying, well, why in the world didn't this work out? And the book of Samuel tells us that, as a matter of fact, that Saul messed up 2 major times. One time, he's calling all of the troops together, and the Israelites are coming from all different 12 tribes, and they're assembling, and they're getting ready to go into battle against the Philistines, but he wants the blessings of Saul to do this, and he wants Saul to sacrifice to God before he goes into battle. Samuel doesn't show up. I should say he wants the blessings of Samuel before he goes into battle. Right. Samuel doesn't show up. He doesn't show up. He doesn't show up. And finally Saul says, "Oh, all right, then I will do it myself." Right? And he no sooner sacrifices to God, and he's usurping the priestly function right here. Then Samuel shows up and says, "What have you done?" Right? And at that point, there's a huge breach between Saul and between Samuel. And the second time that Saul messes up is when he goes into battle against the Amalekites. And instead of completely destroying them and murdering all the warriors and burning down their villages, what he does is he spares their king, for what reason I don't know, but he also takes a lot of the plunder back with him, right? And he's forbidden to do this. And so when the Israelites ask themselves, why is it that things didn't turn out well for Saul, we have the reason, and that is that he's transgressed twice, right? He's usurped the priestly function, and then he didn't carry out the commands of God, which are destroy those people completely, don't have anything to do with them, I don't want you intermarrying with them, I don't want you worshiping their gods, don't come near those people, right? So this is, they want a king, and they need a king, they need a warrior to lead them into battle, but it doesn't go well the first time around. How do you make sense out of this? You make sense out of this because Saul doesn't live up to his end of the bargain.
Right.
Yeah.
So it seems to me like in today, in organizations, you need to have a situation where, you know, people are doing their own thing, but sometimes you do need a leader in order to give it more structure and more force. But if that leader does not adhere to a greater mission, which would be, God's laws, then, excuse my French, then it's gonna be shitstorm. You gotta have, your leader must be aligned with better principles, or it doesn't necessarily matter so much what the rest of them are doing. You need to have not only a strong leader, but a principled leader.
Well, this is really important for the Israelites because they have, many of these people probably heard tales about how their ancestors wandered around in the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years because they didn't obey God, right? There is a long tradition of Yahweh punishing these people for not obeying Him. But the other thing that is really clear in the book of Samuel is that tension between the priest and between the sacred and the secular is just they're colliding with one another. Again, there has not been there's not been a king among these Israelites at all. The prophets and the priests have dominated this society. This is one of the things that David is going to run up against when he becomes king. And one of the things that David does is, you heard her talking many times about how they went to Shiloh to worship, right? This was where the major altar was prior to King David, where the Israelites would go to worship Yahweh. Well, what David does is he grabs that, the Ark of the Covenant and all of the holy symbols that are there at Shiloh, and he brings them back to Jerusalem, right? He really captures that sort of thing because he doesn't want to have that tension between the sacred and the secular. But you see it right here. These two sides are just bouncing up against one another, right? And that's really the story right here. And even Saul, he can't let go of let go of Samuel even after Samuel's dead. He calls him back from the dead, and he wants to know what's going to happen to me. And Samuel just gives it to him. He says, "You're going to die. You have transgressed, and you were going to die." That's not what he was hoping for. But you can see this conflict between the sacred. It doesn't start out well. And the reason that David is able to overcome this is because that David, in fact, does obey God, at least to begin with, right? He gets the covenant from God. But this is what's going on here in Samuel. How did the Israelites make sense out of the fact that God gave them the king that they asked for, but it didn't turn out well? And that is because Saul doesn't live up to his end of the bargain. But then David comes along, and David is a holy man, and David actually is blessed by God. Other questions?
One quick analogy that I would always use is to look at the 13 colonies here.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
really the same concept.
Yeah, budding
As separate colonies, when King George is sending all his troops over, they knew they were up the creek without a paddle. And so they said, we got to come over, and if you study the early history, there were strong Federalists and the strong states' rights and that sort of thing. And David made lots of mistakes, but he was smart enough to bring the secular and the sacred together within Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's really what makes it work. Yeah, and he's not real popular among the priests for doing that at all. But he knows he has to do that if he's going to survive, because it's really what undermines Saul.
And it's interesting that you say, like, we're found separation of church and state is like, that's something that we say America is separation of church and state. And this story is saying we really shouldn't have separation of church and state.
Well, you have to go back and look at European history and the state churches and all throughout Europe.
Right. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with that idea. It's just like, how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, as a pastor, the farther we get away from God, the more problems we have.
That's
some of our
moral of the story.
Yeah, some of our strongest leaders that have made, like Abraham Lincoln, that guy, or even leaders in history like Martin Luther King, and who's the guy in India for that matter, Gandhi. They all had a very strong spiritual girding which helped them lead.
Yeah. Anyone? Any other questions? Anything come up as you were watching this that you want to talk a little bit more about? Or
It's interesting, I think one more quick thing, I'll shut up. You know, in the book of Judges, you have the charismatic military leaders who really fight for more than one tribe. I mean, if they're beaten on, this country's beaten on them, that means it's going to affect those tribes that border on them. But the charismatic military leaders kind of get several tribes to work together and fight against them, but they still don't have that unity, that they really need to establish themselves.
Yeah, if you look at a map of Saul's campaigns, you will see that he went the breadth and the length, the breadth and the length, of the Canaan, fighting with all of the tribes. That's one of the things that he does. He goes north and south and east and west. So he's trying to do that. He's trying to unite them all and get them all to rallies so that they can stand up to these various tribes. But he's got his hands full, and he's only moderately successful. And David, when David becomes king, David still has to continue fighting to bear down these tribes. It's really not until the time of Solomon that they get the kingdom all the way from the Red Sea all the way up to the Euphrates. It's going to take them, about 100 years from the time of Saul down till the time of Solomon to do this. Just to ballpark this is all happening. Saul's probably around 1050 BCE, somewhere in there. Kingdom of David right around the year 1000, something like that. And then Solomon right around down to about 950, somewhere in there. That period, that's what we're looking at right in there. And then, of course, after, and you saw this, she talked about this. After Solomon, there's going to be a huge revolt, and the northern kingdom's going to break off, and then there are going to be two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. But what we have now is we're working towards, or what's going to come out of this, is one united kingdom under one monarchy in Jerusalem. Okay, well, we're going to have to stop. I was hoping we would have some time to delve into some of the chapters in the book of Samuel, but you can go home and you read Samuel yourself. I mean, it's a pretty easy read. It's pretty straightforward history with the hand of God coming in every now and then. All right, so come back next week and we'll talk about, we'll listen to a lecture on David, and we'll talk about King David. All right, thanks for coming.
Thank you.